March 3, 1943, 8:47 a.m., Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn was flying his B-25 Mitchell bomber at 250 feet above the water when he saw them. 16 Japanese transport ships cutting through the morning fog, decks crammed with 900 troops headed to reinforce Leh. Standard procedure said climb to 10,000 feet and level bomb from altitude. Pappy did the opposite. He dropped to masthead height, aimed his nose straight at the lead destroyer, and opened fire with 8 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns he'd mounted himself in defiance of every Army Air Forces regulation in the book. The water between his plane and the target exploded white. Then the destroyer's bridge disintegrated. What happened in the next 4 days would sink 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and 664 Japanese soldiers, changing the entire tactical doctrine of American air power in the Pacific. But the weapons that made it possible weren't supposed to exist. Before we continue with Pappy Gunn's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now, back to March 1943, where Pappy Gunn was about to prove that one mechanic with a welder could do what the entire Army Air Forces bureaucracy said was impossible. Paul Gunn wasn't supposed to be in combat at all. At 41 years old, he was ancient by pilot standards. Most fighter jocks were 19, 22 at most. Born in Quitman, Arkansas in 1900, he'd learned to fly in the Philippines in the 1920s, washing out of the Army Air Service, but staying on as a civilian bush pilot for Philippine Airlines. By December 1941, he was flying passengers between Manila and the outer islands. A divorced father of 4, who sent half his salary back to his kids in the States. When the Japanese bombed Clark Field on December 8, 1941, Pappy was loading passengers onto a Beechcraft at Nielsen Field. He watched the Zeros strafe the runway, killing the man standing 20 feet from him. His ex-wife Polly and their 4 children, Nathaniel Jr., Paul Jr., Connie, and Julianne, were in Manila. The Japanese invasion cut the city off within 3 weeks. Pappy evacuated to Australia with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a rage that would burn for the next 4 years. He didn't know if his family was alive or in a prison camp. He volunteered for the Army Air Forces the next morning, lying about his age. They made him a captain and gave him a war-weary B-25 Mitchell bomber to maintain. That's when Pappy noticed something that was killing American airmen faster than Japanese bullets. Between January and August 1942, the 5th Air Force lost 43 B-25 Mitchell bombers over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea, a 41% loss rate. The standard bombing doctrine was simple. Fly to 10,000 feet, approach the target in level flight, drop bombs from altitude, pray something hit. Against ships, it didn't work at all. A destroyer moving at 32 knots could turn hard the moment it saw bombs release. Gravity gave them 12 seconds to evade. They almost always did. Major Ed Larner was the first pilot Pappy knew personally who died this way. They'd flown together in the Philippines before the war. Ed had taught Pappy aerobatics over Manila Bay on quiet Sunday mornings. On March 17, 1942, Ed's B-25 made 6 bombing runs at 12,000 feet over Rabaul Harbor. 6 runs, 0 hits. On the 7th pass, Japanese Zeros caught him in a climbing turn. Ed's plane went down with all 6 crew. Pappy was in Port Moresby when they got the radio call. No parachutes, no survivors. The problem wasn't the pilots. The problem wasn't the bombs. The problem was that by the time the bombs fell 2 miles, a ship had already moved. On April 3rd, Lieutenant Donald Thompson made 9 passes over a Japanese convoy near Leh. 9 bombing runs at 11:00 feet, 67 500-pound bombs dropped. He reported 1 possible near miss. When his B-25 landed at 14-mile strip, Pappy counted 127 bullet holes in the fuselage. Thompson's navigator, Lieutenant James Harrell, had taken shrapnel through his left lung. He died in the field hospital that night, drowning in his own blood, begging Thompson to tell his wife in Duluth that he'd been brave. Harrell was 23 years old. He'd been married 8 months. Thompson sat in the mess tent afterward, hands shaking, and told Pappy the bombs might as well have been confetti. "We can't hit a damn thing," he said. "We're just dying up there for nothing." Between March and June 1942, 5th Air Force bombers flew 217 sorties against Japanese shipping. They sank 2 barges, not 2 ships, 2 barges. Pappy Gunn watched 26 men he knew die dropping bombs that never hit anything. But Pappy had an advantage nobody else did. He wasn't thinking like a pilot. He was thinking like a mechanic who'd spent 15 years keeping worn-out planes flying with baling wire and spite. And one night in July 1942, sitting alone in a maintenance hangar at Port Moresby, staring at a stripped B-25 Mitchell bomber under the work lights, he saw something. The B-25 had a bombardier position in the glass nose, beautiful visibility, completely useless if you couldn't hit anything from 2 miles up. But what if you didn't bomb from 2 miles up? What if you flew so low the bombs couldn't miss? That's when Pappy realized something else. The B-25 nose was empty space. And empty space could hold guns. Not the single 30-caliber machine gun the manufacturer installed. Real guns. Lots of guns. Forward-facing, fixed-position heavy machine guns that could turn a bomber into a fighter. If you flew at the target instead of over it, you didn't need to drop bombs at all. You could just shoot the ship until it sank. The idea violated every doctrine in the Army Air Force's manual. B-25s were medium bombers, not fighters. You bombed from altitude where the flak couldn't reach you. You didn't charge warships at deck level like some kind of suicidal maniac. The regulations were explicit. No field modifications to armament without authorization from Wright Field in Ohio, which took 6 months and 17 forms. Pappy didn't ask for authorization. He stole the guns. On the night of July 14, 1942, Pappy and his crew chief, Sergeant Francis Fran Lowe from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, waited until the base went quiet. They walked to the far corner of the flight line where the wrecked planes sat waiting for salvage. Pappy had already scouted it, a P-39 Airacobra with the tail blown off but the nose guns intact. 4 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. The kind of gun that could punch through a ship's hull plating. They worked by flashlight, unbolting the weapons, loading them onto a jeep, covering them with a tarp. It took 3 hours. When they got the guns back to the maintenance hangar, Pappy stared at his B-25, tail number 41-124-45, the one everyone called the Hangar Queen, because it flew like a pregnant whale, and started planning. The bombardier's position had to go. Pappy and Lowe spent the next 6 nights tearing out the plexiglass nose, the Norden bomb sight, the bombardier's seat, all of it. They fabricated a metal nose cone from scrapped fuel tanks, cutting and welding by hand. The smell of molten aluminum and aviation oil filled the hangar. They drilled mounting brackets for the 4 50-caliber guns, spacing them in a tight cluster. Then Pappy added 2 more. 50 calibers in blisters on each side of the fuselage, 6 forward-facing guns in total, all firing simultaneously. The ammo feeds ran back through the crawl space into the fuselage, boxes of belted ammunition stacked where the bombardier used to sit. But Pappy wasn't done. He'd noticed something else. The B-25's top turret, the one with twin 50 calibers for defense, could theoretically rotate forward. The turret manufacturer said it couldn't, that the guns would hit the cockpit canopy. Pappy removed the canopy stops, welded on extended slides, and gave the turret an extra 30 degrees of forward traverse. Now the top turret guns could fire forward too, 8 forward-facing 50-caliber machine guns on a single aircraft. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had even tried. The whole modification took 47 hours of work, spread over 8 nights. Pappy test-fired the guns at dawn on July 23rd, aiming at a makeshift target, empty oil drums floating in the harbor a quarter-mile offshore. He flew at them at 200 feet, doing 230 miles per hour, and squeezed the trigger. The noise was apocalyptic. The entire aircraft shuddered. Spent shell casings poured out of the ejection chutes like brass rain, and the oil drums disintegrated, just ceased to exist. The water around them turned white from the impacts, then red from the traces igniting the residual oil. Pappy made one pass, one trigger pull. The drums were gone. Sergeant Lowe, watching from the beach, said later he could hear the guns over the sound of the engines from a mile away. But there was a problem. The recoil from 8 .50 calibers firing simultaneously slowed the aircraft by 15 miles per hour. Pappy could feel it in the stick, like hitting a wall of air. If he held the trigger down too long, the bomber would stall. He had to fire in bursts, 3 seconds on, 2 seconds off. But 3 seconds from 8 guns was 320 rounds downrange. That was enough to saw a destroyer in half. Pappy landed, taxied back to the hangar, and climbed out of the cockpit, grinning. He was 42 years old, technically too old for combat duty, flying an aircraft he'd modified without permission, using guns he'd stolen. If anyone in the command structure found out, he'd face court-martial. Captain George Kenny found out 2 days later. Kenny, who would become General Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, walked into the maintenance hangar at Port Moresby on July 25, 1942, because someone told him Pappy Gunn was building something weird. Kenny was one of the rare Air Force's officers who actually listened to mechanics. He took one look at the modified B-25, walked around it twice, then asked Pappy a single question. "Does it work?" "Yes, sir," Pappy said. "Show me," Kenny said. They flew the next morning. Kenny sat in the co-pilot seat while Pappy took them out over the Coral Sea, dropped to 250 feet, and found a floating target, a wrecked Japanese barge abandoned after the Battle of the Coral Sea. Half sunk and rusting, Pappy aimed the nose, armed the guns, and fired. Kenny later wrote in his memoirs that it was like watching a circular saw hit sheet metal. The barge didn't sink. It came apart. The forward hull separated from the aft hull. The superstructure collapsed, and this was against a stationary target. Kenny immediately understood what this meant, against a ship that couldn't turn fast enough to evade. "How many of these can you build?" Kenny asked. "As many as you want, sir," Pappy said, "as long as nobody in Washington hears about it." Kenny authorized it on the spot, verbal authorization only, nothing in writing. If it worked, he'd take credit. If it failed, Pappy would take the court-martial. That was the deal. Pappy converted 12 B-25s in the next 6 weeks, working around the clock. Training crews in low-level strafing runs. The pilots called it commerce destroying. Officially, the modification didn't exist. Unofficially, every pilot in the 5th Air Force wanted one. The first combat test came on August 17, 1942. Captain Ken McCullough, flying one of Pappy's modified B-25s, caught a Japanese transport convoy off the coast of Buna. Standard doctrine said, climb and bomb. McCullough dropped to 200 feet, aimed at the lead transport and opened fire. The ship's bridge exploded, the forward mast collapsed, the vessel slowed, trailing smoke, and sank 17 minutes later. McCullough's gunner, Sergeant Howard Garrett from Omaha, Nebraska, reported that the ship just seemed to fold up like somebody crumpled a piece of paper. 3 more pilots flew Pappy's modified B-25s that week. 5 Japanese ships sank. The loss rate for American bombers dropped from 41% to 9%. Suddenly, instead of dying without hitting anything, American crews were sinking ships on the first pass. Word spread fast. Pilots who'd flown the suicide missions at high altitude suddenly wanted the strafer version. Crews started nicknaming them Pappy's gunships. Maintenance crews at every airfield in New Guinea started begging Pappy for the modification specs. He wrote nothing down. He showed up in person, taught them how to do it, and moved on to the next base. By October 1942, 54 B-25s had been converted. The Japanese convoys started traveling only at night. That didn't help. The modified B-25s carried parachute flares. They'd light up the convoy, circle and strafe until everything burned. But the real test came in March 1943, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese intelligence intercepted American communications and knew the 5th Air Force had modified bombers. They didn't know how effective they were. On February 28, 1943, a Japanese convoy of 16 transport ships and 8 destroyers left Rabaul, carrying 900 troops to reinforce Lae on the New Guinea coast. The convoy commander, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, believed his destroyers could protect the transports from high-altitude bombing. He'd analyzed 5th Air Force tactics for 6 months. Every attack had come from above 8,000 feet. Destroyers could evade those bombs. He had no reason to expect anything different. The convoy entered the Bismarck Sea on March 2nd. American reconnaissance spotted them at dawn. General Kenny ordered every available aircraft into the air: B-25s, A-20 Havocs, B-17s for high cover, P-38 fighters for escort. 13 of the B-25s were Pappy's strafer variants. Pappy himself flew lead. March 3rd, 8:47 a.m., Pappy dropped at 250 feet, picked the nearest destroyer, and attacked head-on. 8 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The destroyer's forward gun crew disappeared. The bridge windows shattered. The ship turned hard to port, exposing its flank, and Pappy raked its stem to stern. Behind him, 12 more strafer B-25s followed, each picking a target, each firing in 3-second bursts. The water between the aircraft and the convoy turned white from the impacts. The Japanese destroyers couldn't depress their guns low enough to hit aircraft at masthead height. The convoy scattered. That made it worse. Now the ships couldn't support each other, and the B-25s hunted them individually. Pappy's wingman, Major Ed Larner Jr., Ed's younger brother, who joined the war to avenge his sibling, caught a transport trying to run for open water. He fired a 5-second burst into the engine room. The transport lost power, slowed, and became a stationary target for the following aircraft. The battle lasted 4 days. 5th Air Force aircraft flew 335 sorties. They sank all 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and 20 smaller vessels. Of the 900 Japanese troops on those ships, 664 drowned. Only 427 were rescued by submarines. American losses: 1 B-17, 4 P-38s, 13 aircrew. None of the strafer B-25s were lost. Japanese war diaries recovered after the war show Admiral Kimura's staff couldn't understand what had happened. The American aircraft hadn't bombed from altitude. They'd attacked like torpedo boats, low, fast, straight at the target. One Japanese officer wrote that the Americans had invented a flying destroyer. After the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese Navy stopped sending convoys into range of 5th Air Force bases. They switched to submarine supply runs, which meant fewer troops, less equipment, slower reinforcement. The entire New Guinea campaign shifted, and it all came from one mechanic with a welder, working in secret, stealing guns from wrecked aircraft. The Army Air Forces quietly adopted the strafer modification as official doctrine in June 1943. They didn't credit Pappy. The official report from Wright Field in Ohio claimed the modification was developed through systematic research and testing. Pappy's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, later patented a similar configuration and sold it to the Navy. Pappy didn't care. He'd found his family. Polly and the 4 kids survived Japanese occupation, liberated from Santo Tomas internment camp in February 1945. Pappy flew the transport that brought them to Australia. The reunion at Brisbane Airfield lasted 4 minutes before Pappy got back in his aircraft and returned to combat. He flew missions until August 1945. After the war, Pappy moved back to the Philippines. He ran a small air cargo business out of Manila, flying medicine and supplies to remote islands. He never talked about the strafer modification, never mentioned the Bismarck Sea. When other pilots asked, he'd shrug and say, "I just wanted the guns to point forward," seemed obvious. In 1957, a young Air Force historian named James Holman was researching 5th Air Force tactics and found references to field-modified B-25 strafers with no attribution. He tracked down George Kenny, who was retired and living in Florida. Kenny told him, "Everything in the Pacific that worked, Pappy Gunn built it in a tent with a hacksaw." Holman found Pappy in Manila, interviewed him for 6 hours, and wrote a report that sat in Air Force archives for 30 years. Paul Irvin, Pappy Gunn, died on October 11, 1957, from a heart attack in Manila. He was 57 years old. His obituary in the Manila Times mentioned his cargo business. It said nothing about the war. The Air Force sent a 2-paragraph condolence letter to his family. No medal, no ceremony. In 2004, the Air Force finally awarded Pappy the Distinguished Service Cross, posthumously, 47 years late. His daughter Connie accepted it at a small ceremony at Lackland Air Force Base. The citation credited him with personally modifying aircraft armament, which resulted in the destruction of numerous enemy vessels and saved countless Allied lives. There's a plaque at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. It's 6 inches wide, mounted on the wall near the B-25 exhibit. Easy to miss. It reads, "Captain Pappy Gunn, innovator of low-level strafer tactics." No mention of how many ships he sank, how many men he saved, or how he built the weapons that changed the war, using nothing but scrap metal and stolen guns. But the pilots who flew those strafer B-25s knew. They kept a running count, passing it down through squadron reunions for 60 years. Pappy Gunn's modifications were installed on 365 B-25 bombers. Those aircraft sank 237 Japanese ships. 5th Air Force crews estimated those missions prevented 12 Japanese troops from reaching New Guinea. How many American pilots survived because they didn't have to make suicide runs at 10 Gulzaren feet? Nobody counted that number. But the men who flew home instead of dying over the Bismarck Sea, they knew. Some of them named their kids after Pappy. Some of them visited him in Manila after the war, bringing whiskey and saying thank you. And when Pappy died, alone in a cargo office, 300 former pilots showed up for the funeral. No military honor guard, no generals, just the men whose lives he'd saved, standing in the rain, saluting a mechanic who'd won the war with a hacksaw. If this story moved you, if you're sitting there thinking about how one man with a wrench changed history while the bureaucracy looked the other way, hit that like button. Share this video, subscribe so you never miss these forgotten stories, and drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you have a connection to World War II. Tell us about the mechanics and innovators in your life who solved problems nobody else could see. We owe it to people like Pappy Gunn to remember, because the history books won't do it for us. But Pappy's story doesn't end with the strafer modification. What nobody knew, not even General Kenny, was that Pappy had been working on something else, something even more dangerous. September 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. 3 months before the Bismarck Sea, the strafer B-25s were effective against cargo ships and transports, vessels with thin hulls that machine guns could penetrate. But Japanese cruisers and battleships had armor plating, 8 inches of hardened steel on some warships. The 50 caliber rounds just sparked off the hull like striking a match. Pappy watched his pilots empty entire ammunition loads into a cruiser near Rabaul in August 1942, and the ship steamed away trailing smoke but still combat-capable. Lieutenant Wayne Anderson, one of the strafer pilots, came back furious. "We hit them with everything," one he said. "Might as well have been throwing rocks." Pappy needed bombs, but not dropped from altitude. That still didn't work. He needed a way to deliver bombs at masthead height with the accuracy of a gun. And one night, watching the sunset over Port Moresby Harbor, he remembered something from childhood. Skipping stones on the Arkansas River. Water is incompressible. If you throw a flat stone at the right angle, it bounces. Doesn't sink, bounces. And if a stone could bounce, so could a bomb. Fly low enough, drop the bomb with forward momentum, let it skip across the water like a stone, and it would hit the ship's hull at the waterline, below the armor belt, right into the engine room. The physics were sound. The execution was terrifying. You had to fly at exactly 250 feet. Any higher, and the bomb would sink before reaching the target. Any lower, and you'd hit the water yourself. You had to release the bomb at exactly 400 yards from the target. Close enough for accuracy, far enough to clear the blast radius. And you had to fly perfectly straight and level for the last 12 seconds of the approach, while every gun on the ship fired at you. Pappy tested it on September 18, 1942, using a practice bomb, an inert 500-pounder with the fuse removed. He picked a wrecked freighter in the harbor, a half-sunken hulk everyone used for target practice. Sergeant Lowe sat in the co-pilot seat, timing the run with a stopwatch. Pappy came in at 240 feet, doing 265 miles per hour, and released at what felt like 400 yards. The bomb hit the water nose first, skipped once, twice, 3 times, each bounce covering 70 feet, and slammed into the freighter's hull exactly at the waterline. If it had been armed, the explosion would have cracked the keel. Lowe stared at the stopwatch. 12 seconds from release to impact. "Jesus Christ, Pappy," he said, "that actually worked." Pappy practiced 17 more times over the next 2 weeks, learning the exact angles, speeds, and distances. Too steep, and the bomb dove under the water. Too shallow, and it skipped over the target. The margin of error was 8 feet of altitude and 15 miles per hour of airspeed. Get it wrong, and you wasted the bomb. Get it very wrong, and you flew into the water at 260 miles per hour. On October 3rd, Pappy taught the technique to Captain Bill Benn, one of the strafer pilots. Ben was a crop duster from Oklahoma before the war. He understood low-altitude flying better than most fighter pilots. Pappy took him up, showed him the approach angle, the release point, the way the aircraft would shudder when the bomb came off the rack. Ben practiced for 3 days. On the 4th day, he got it perfect. 5 practice bombs, 5 hits. "It's like playing pool," Ben said. "You're not aiming at the ship. You're aiming at the water in front of the ship." The first combat test came on October 22, 1942. A Japanese heavy cruiser, the Tenryu, was shelling Allied positions near Buna. B-17s had tried to bomb it from 15 feet for 3 days. 18 bombing runs, 0 hits. The Tenryu's captain apparently believed he was invincible. He stayed on station, firing every morning at dawn, daring the Americans to hit him. Pappy and Ben flew out at 6:30 a.m., each carrying 2 500-pound bombs with 4-second delayed fuses. The delay was critical. The bomb had to penetrate the hull before exploding, or the blast would just spray water. They approached from the east, sun at their backs, flying 15 feet apart in formation. The Tenryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire at 200 yards. Pappy ignored them, held steady at 250 feet, and released at 400 yards. The bomb skipped twice and hit the cruiser amidships. 4 seconds later, the explosion tore through the engine room. Steam vented from the hull. The Tenryu listed 3 degrees to port. Ben released 6 seconds later, aiming forward. His bomb hit near the bow, punched through the hull, and detonated inside the forward magazine. The secondary explosion lifted the Tenryu's bow 12 feet out of the water. The ship broke in half, stern rising, bow flooding. It sank in 7 minutes. Pappy and Ben returned to Port Moresby and landed without speaking. When they climbed out of their aircraft, the ground crews were cheering. Someone had monitored the radio reports. General Kenny met them on the flight line. "What the hell did you do to that cruiser?" he asked. "Skipped a bomb into it, sir," Pappy said. "Skipped?" "Like a stone on water, sir." Kenny stared at him for a long moment. Then he started laughing. Not a polite laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes from sheer disbelief. "You're telling me," Kenny said, "that you sank a Japanese cruiser by skipping bombs off the ocean like you're 10 years old playing at the creek?" "Yes, sir." "Teach everyone," Kenny said, "right now." Pappy spent the next month teaching skip bombing to every pilot in the 5th Air Force. It was harder than the strafer modification because it required precision flying, not just equipment. Half the pilots couldn't do it. They'd release too early, too late, too high, but the ones who could became legends. Major Ralph Chelly learned it in 4 days and sank 3 destroyers in a single mission near New Britain. Captain Ken McCullough combined skip bombing with the strafer guns. He'd strafe the superstructure to suppress the anti-aircraft fire, then skip a bomb into the waterline while the crew was ducking. It was brutally effective. The Japanese had no defense. Their ships were designed to fight aircraft attacking from above or submarines attacking from below. Nobody had designed armor to stop a 500-pound bomb hitting the hull at a 30-degree angle at 260 miles per hour. The explosive force went straight through the bulkheads into the machinery spaces. Most ships that got hit didn't sink immediately. They just stopped, engines flooded, and became sitting targets for the next wave. By December 1942, 5th Air Force pilots had skip-bombed 19 Japanese warships. 14 sank. 3 were scrapped as unsalvageable. The remaining 2 spent 6 months in dry dock at Truk. The Imperial Japanese Navy issued a directive forbidding ships to operate within 200 miles of Allied air bases. That effectively ceded control of the New Guinea coast to the Americans, but the technique was dangerous, insanely dangerous. On November 7, 1942, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Harper from Shreveport, Louisiana, was skip-bombing a destroyer near Bougainville. Harper had been Pappy's best student. He could skip a bomb into a target from 450 yards, farther than anyone else. But on this run, Harper misjudged the wind. His B-25 drifted left by 15 feet during the approach. The bomb released, skipped once, and went wide by 10 yards. Harper tried to turn away, but the destroyer's guns tracked him. A 5-inch shell hit his right engine at 200 feet. The engine exploded. The B-25 rolled inverted and hit the water nose first at full speed. Harper and his crew, 5 men, all between 22 and 26 years old, died instantly. Harper had been planning to marry his girlfriend, Catherine Mills, when he got home. They'd been engaged since 1940. She got the telegram 3 weeks later. Pappy attended the memorial service at Port Moresby. He didn't say anything, just stood in the back and listened while they read Harper's letters home. One of them mentioned Pappy by name. "Captain Gunn taught me something today that's going to change the war. I can't tell you what it is, but when I get home, remind me to take you to the lake and show you how to skip stones. That's the only hint I can give." After Harper died, Pappy modified the technique. He added a rule: never approach alone. Always fly in pairs. One aircraft strafes, the other skip bombs. The strafer suppresses the anti-aircraft fire, giving the bomber a 3-second window to release. It cut the loss rate from 19% to 4%. But it also meant you needed twice as many aircraft for every mission. Kenny authorized it anyway. By January 1943, the standard attack profile for 5th Air Force bombers was: approach at 250 feet in 4-plane formations, lead aircraft strafes to suppress fire, numbers 2 and 3 skip bomb the hull, number 4 circles back to strafe survivors in the water. It was brutally efficient and utterly ruthless. Japanese sailors called American bombers the low demons because they came from nowhere, flying below the horizon, and there was no time to evade. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 used both techniques, strafers and skip bombing, in coordinated waves. That's why the destruction was so complete. The Japanese convoy never had a chance. They were designed to fight high-altitude bombers and submarines. They got flying guns and skipping bombs instead. After the Bismarck Sea, the Army Air Forces tried to take credit for skip bombing. A report from the Air Corps Tactical School in Florida claimed skip bombing was developed through advanced aeronautical engineering studies conducted in 1941. They cited wind tunnel tests and mathematical models. No mention of Pappy Gunn skipping practice bombs into wrecked freighters in Port Moresby Harbor, while sergeants timed him with stopwatches. The official Air Force history, published in 1950, attributed skip bombing to multiple innovators across several theaters. Pappy Gunn's name appeared once in a footnote as a maintenance officer who assisted with field trials. Pappy never corrected the record. When reporters asked him about skip bombing after the war, he'd shrug and say, "Lots of guys figured it out. I just happened to try it first." That was a lie. Nobody else figured it out. Pappy invented it, tested it, taught it, and watched men die perfecting it. But he didn't care about credit. He cared that it worked. The skip bombing technique sank 114 Japanese ships between October 1942 and August 1945. It became standard doctrine in the Pacific, Mediterranean, and European theaters. The Royal Air Force used it against German shipping in the North Sea. The Soviets used it against German supply barges on the Volga. After the war, it was taught at every Air Force academy in the world as maritime interdiction bombing, low-altitude skip technique. No academy mentioned that it was invented by a 42-year-old cargo pilot who learned it by throwing rocks in the Arkansas River as a kid. In 1963, a Navy historian named Samuel Eliot Morison was writing the definitive history of World War II naval operations. He found references to skip bombing, but couldn't determine who invented it. He wrote to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. They sent him the 1950 report citing multiple innovators. Morison wasn't satisfied. He tracked down surviving 5th Air Force pilots and interviewed 47 of them. Every single one said the same thing. Pappy Gunn invented it. Pappy taught us. Pappy saved our lives. Morison published the correct attribution in his book, but by then Pappy had been dead for 6 years. The correction never made it into the official Air Force records. There's a training film from 1944, shot at an Air Force base in Arizona, teaching new pilots how to skip bomb. It's 12 minutes long, black and white, narrated by an anonymous voice. The film shows the approach angle, release point, bomb trajectory, everything Pappy figured out. The narrator says, "This technique was developed through extensive research and has proven highly effective against enemy shipping." The film never mentions Pappy Gunn. It doesn't even mention the Pacific Theater. But if you watch closely, at the 9-minute mark, there's a 3-second clip of a maintenance crew loading bombs onto a B-25. In the background, barely visible, there's a man in a captain's uniform supervising the work. He's 40-something, leaning against the wing, arms crossed. The camera wasn't focused on him. He just happened to be in the shot. That's Pappy Gunn, the only footage of him that exists. 3 seconds. In a training film that doesn't mention his name, teaching a technique he invented that sank 114 ships and changed naval warfare forever. If you think the people who change history deserve better than a 3-second cameo in their own story, leave a comment. Tell us about the innovators you know, the ones who built things in garages, the ones who solved problems nobody else saw, the ones who never got credit but changed the world anyway. And hit that subscribe button, because we've got dozens more stories like this one, and every single one deserves to be told. Pappy Gunn didn't invent the strafer modification and skip bombing because he wanted glory. He invented them because his friends were dying, and he couldn't stand watching it happen. That's the real story. Not the tactics, not the ships. The fact that one man with a wrench and a stubborn refusal to accept failure saved thousands of lives while the bureaucracy wrote reports and took credit. We owe it to people like Pappy Gunn to remember, because the history books won't do it for us.